Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Of course, follow us, review. Remember the reviews. Really would appreciate the reviews on Apple or whatever platform you're listening on, and join our Patreon. We have links in the show notes to make all of this easy to do. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations and exploring big topics or asking pressing questions such as, have Christians forgotten the first commandment? Have Christians forgotten the first commandment? The first commandment being, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then Jesus in the New Testament kind of echoes this, but with the greatest commandment, as he was asked, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, before you tune out, if you're not religious or not Christian or atheist, that's cool. I'm not going to beat you over the head with my Bible. Although, I don't know, might be fun. But before you tune out, this is not a sermon. I am not a pastor, but I read my Bible every day. But this is more about our Christian neighbors. Like I said, I'm a Christian. It's more about us as Christians and our participation in this democratic project, this American experiment, right? And I wonder, if for me as a Christian, if my moral compass is set to a true north and my civic participation is guided by certain principles, a certain philosophy, or in my case, theology, am I being true to that? Or am I backing preferences and prejudices? Am I backing a theology into a priori, like already formed prejudices and preferences? So that's the question I'm asking. And I'm asking it of my brothers and sisters in the church, and also for those more generally. Like, do you start with your political preferences and back a morality into it? So it's a big question. Now, how does this fit in? Have Christians forgotten the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That deals with, we could think of idolatry, but I think we get confused because we think of idolatry as like something so different than our acts of worship, our religious practices, if you will, than, and idolatry is something completely different, carving a wooden image and then worshiping the carved image. To me, that's not the idolatry that we got to be worried about. The idolatry that we got to be worried about is an idolatry that looks like our religious practices, but is only about 5 or 10 degrees off of those religious practices. Does that make sense? So, as opposed to like just forgetting about, and again, even for those who aren't religious, forgetting about, what we would think of and what we were raised up on in terms of morality and ethics, and doing away with that and, exercising other practices altogether. It's a moral code that's off by just a few degrees, or if you are religious, going to church and doing these things and singing songs and praying and all that stuff, you could be doing all that stuff, but it's just a few degrees off of true north, what's truly good, what's truly, in certain religions, orthodox, if you will. So for us, for Christians and for Jewish people, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, that is authoritative, right? So thou shalt have no other gods before me. What does that look like? That looks like, what I'm talking about, the few degrees off, here's what I'm talking about. We are either rejecting, as Christians, we are either rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts, and I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these. Rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts, replacing the God of Scripture with a God of our own making. Instead of being created in the image of God, we're creating a God in our image, right? Or we're replacing God or a religion around the worship of God with a religion of politics, When you start, like I said, when you start with a political affiliation in this case and back everything else into that, a morality, all sense of truth, good and evil, and even basic decency. So let's dive into each one of these questions. Have Christians forgotten the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Starting with that first one that I mentioned, rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts. And again, even if you're not a Christian, even if you're not religious at all, from a literary standpoint, the Jesus that we meet in those gospel accounts, just from a literary standpoint, is a moral figure, a moral teacher, right? At the very least, we believe that it's more than that as Christians, obviously. But there was an incident recently, and many of you might have read about it, heard about it in the news. Bishop Marian Edgar Budde, the bishop of the Washington Diocese of the Episcopal Church. A lot of people didn't pay any attention to her whole sermon, only the part at the very end when she addressed Donald Trump, the day after the inauguration, when she had, this is the controversial part, she had the audacity to ask him, "Have mercy, Mr. President." So somehow that became very controversial, that she addressed the president, the new president, newly inaugurated president, directly and said, "Have mercy, Mr. President." That was somehow very controversial. But what a lot of folks didn't pay attention to was the rest of the sermon, the rest of the homily. So quoting directly from her sermon now, I'll give you, just a little piece of something else that she said. Quote, "Jesus of Nazareth, in his Sermon on the Mount, exhorts us to love not only our neighbors, but to love our enemies, and to pray for those who persecute us, to be merciful as our God is merciful, and to forgive others as God forgives us. Jesus went out of his way to welcome those whom his society deemed as outcasts." And, again, so throughout her sermon, throughout this homily, she was quoting directly from scripture or echoing what Jesus himself was saying. And this homily got such harsh reaction from Republican elected officials, as she's an extremist, and, from Trump himself, from others in Trump's orbit. And I always watch in awe and fascination, and admittedly sometimes disgust, as this harsh reaction happens. So being the troublemaker that I am, I just posted something. Actually, I reposted something from a pastor friend of mine from Florida, a fellow who was on the show a few weeks ago, Joe Smith, about Bishop Budde. And one of the comments I got was from a fellow that I used to go to church with, that I was in a Bible study with. And he said, in response to this post, he said, "A couple of scriptures come to mind, 2 Timothy 4:3-4, and the verse is, 'For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions,'" et cetera, et cetera. He went on to say, in his comment, he also said, another one would be 1 John 4:1-6, which is about false prophets. And he closed by saying, "The other that struck me was that she's a bishop? How is that?" So, okay. I'll tell you, my response to this fellow was, of the many passages of scripture that she quoted, which offended you the most? Of the words of Jesus that she echoed, which offended you the most? Pretty straightforward question. Not obviously, but I didn't get a response to that. Again, maybe I was just looking for some trouble. No, actually, I was doing what Jesus does. I was answering a question with a question, right? So let me respond in a little bit more detail to this fella. The first part of his objection was saying that people with itching ears will accumulate themselves teachers to suit their own passions. Yes, indeed. I think you should take your own exhortation there. What was it about Marian Budde's homily that offended you? What was it about the scripture, again, that she quoted that offended you? What was it about the words of Jesus that she echoed that offended you? So I didn't start with my own passion, and I was looking for someone to suit it. I started with scripture. I started with the words of Jesus. And I appreciated how she was putting together the words of Jesus himself and other passages from scripture. But I think, if I may, that you started with a prejudice that you voiced at the very end of your comment. The other struck me was that she's a bishop, and if you think there's only one answer to the idea that someone has to be male in order to be a teacher, setting aside the fact that this was a prayer service, a pluralistic prayer service for our country, which is a pluralistic country, not a service in your church. So again, this is the caveat. If you want to go to a church that teaches that only men can teach, that's your prerogative. That debate has been going on for a couple thousand years, and there's still no consensus around it. You may want there to be a consensus. Other churches insist there should be a consensus. Listen to me or else. But the fact is, those conversations are still happening. And some denominations have come to the conclusion that, yeah, no, Paul was just writing to a particular synagogue at a particular time. And this whole male-only leadership teaching thing was for that time and that place. And in this case, the Episcopal Church came to that conclusion. That's why people like Bishop Budde are in these positions. That's a denomination, and I find that to be a compelling case. Either way, it doesn't necessarily apply here because this was a pluralistic service that she happened to have a place where she could participate in this prayer service, right? So let's set that aside. That's a prejudice of yours, or at the very least, a nicer way to put it is a preference of yours, and it's a debate that hasn't been settled. So I'm going to set that aside for a second. But to your first point, the time is coming. We'll endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. I'm here to tell you, buddy, that you're wandering off into myths because why? You started with a certain preference, and now you're dismissing everything that this person said. Every passage of scripture, every quote that from Jesus himself, you dismiss the whole thing. Why? Because you started with a certain preference. Now nothing else. You can't hear anything else. I say, you started with a political preference as well. That people that you root for and you voted for said the next day, "Oh, she's terrible because she had the audacity to, in their eyes, criticize, Donald Trump." So I would say that's a you issue, dude. That is a you issue. 1 John 4, 1-6, kind of along the same lines, false prophets. I don't know, man. If you're quoting at length passages of scripture, if a teacher is quoting at length passages of scripture and then echoing the words of Jesus, I'm listening. If you're doing something different where you're taking the Bible as if it's a huge piece of glass and you're shattering it. And then you're taking those shards of scripture, a little half a verse here and a half a verse there, in order to a priori, to suit arguments that you've come to a priori, like you've already come to those political or social positions. And now you're taking those shards of scripture and trying to, stab them into the argument that you've already made, as opposed to take what I believe Bishop Budde did here, which is taking longer pieces of scripture and building a message around longer passages. That's a better reading and a better use of scripture, a better way to learn scripture, right? A better way to learn, even if it's not about the Bible per se, but about philosophy. Don't take like 3 little words of what any great philosopher said. Take a whole chapter of what he or she said, and then let's reckon with that. So that, I think, is a much better way to look at how Bishop Budde handled that situation. There was another writer. That addressed this as well. A fellow named John Pavlovitz. He's writing for Substack. He's got a great Substack called The Beautiful Mess, and he had one on. This is not about Bishop Budde, because that's only one example of how this plays out. How the issue, again, of rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts. That's really what I'm talking about, not just the issue that recently came up with Bishop Budde. But Pavlovitz, in his edition on the 12th, February 12th, it was titled "The American Church Needs Courageous Christians." Now, know that John Pavlovitz is a 25-year veteran in the trenches of local church ministry. He's a writer, he's a pastor, he's authored several books, and he lives in Wake Forest, North Carolina. So one of the things that caught my attention, I'll quote a little bit at length here. He said, "The world is supposed to look at us collectively." He's talking about Christians. "The world is supposed to look at us collectively, at how we live, love, speak, and forgive, and see what Jesus looked like when his feet were on the planet." Pavlovitz goes on to say, "I think the world more commonly sees something monstrous. I think it sees something that looks right at home in politics of fear, in the intolerance toward outsiders, in the ugliness of bigotry that is helming our nation right now. In so many instances, for a watching world, there is no distinction between the supposed ambassadors for Christ and the sycophantic shills for a godless president without morality or empathy. That's a problem, a disgrace, and a sin." That really captured my attention. And man, as Christians, we really have to think about that. Are we looking more like the Jesus? I'm not quoting Pavlov, this is just me. Are we looking more like the Jesus that we encounter in the gospel accounts? Or are we looking a lot more like, the sycophants of a godless president? So that's something to think about. Now, that is the first part of "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." One way that that's playing out, rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts. I've mentioned it before, but Dr. Russell Moore, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, has said it, a few times. He said it on this program, where he's been in situations where he's been quoting directly from the Sermon on the Mount, directly from Jesus. And the response he gets from certain folks at churches is, where'd you get that liberal Marxist stuff from? And, his is a common, it's happened to me as well, where, hey, dude, this is Jesus, quoting directly from the Bible. So yeah, this is a common occurrence, unfortunately, and we have to be reckoning with this as Christians. The second way is we are replacing the God of Scripture with a God of our own making. And I'm asking myself this too, in what ways am I really, as a Christian, or again, if we're looking at this in a non-religious way, really earnestly exploring what is good, what is true, what is right, kind of an ethical exploration, and always trying to point our compass to finding what is good and true and right, not based on our own preferences, but what is transcendently true and good and right. So, the religious way or the Christian way of thinking about it is, are we replacing the God of Scripture with a God of our own making? Again, idolatry isn't necessarily about replacing God with something totally different, like wooden statues. It's more often about replacing the real God with something that looks like God, but is just a few degrees off. And sometimes it's the very opposite, like celebrating the wrong side of biblical equations. I've talked about this before, like the fruit of the Spirit. When we talk about, if you found a way to vote for the current president, the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I get it. There's any number of reasons that people did that. But if we're going to sit here and say that he's a godly man, come on. Let's just stop. Let's look at the Bible and see what it says. And I can open up to just about any page of the Bible, and it testifies against the words, actions, and character of Donald Trump. No, I didn't start with that prejudice as a prejudice. I start with it with his words, actions, and character almost every day. And then I open up my Bible, or I open up my Bible first, because I do read it first thing in the morning every day. And almost every page of the Bible testifies against the words, character, and actions of Donald freaking Trump. Okay? So don't even start with the Trump derangement syndrome. The Trump derangement syndrome is looking at what he says and does and pretending that it is the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, and pretending that Donald Trump is all those things. He's on the other side of that. And like I said, I can open up to just about any page of the Bible, and it testifies against. So Trump derangement syndrome, is pretending what his words, actions, and character are, and it's godly, and it's scriptural. It's the virtues that are espoused in Scripture. So let's not pretend, replacing God of Scripture with a God of our own making. You've seen those flags. You've seen those flags flying at the back of somebody's pickup truck. It's a Rambo Jesus, a Jesus that is looking like Rambo. That's not the Jesus we meet in Scripture. or a Trump as Jesus. You know, we've seen that. We've seen books written about the godliness of Trump, about Trump as the the coming of man, as some sort of part of the messianic equation. We've seen those books, you know, and I find it ironic and tragic when we have these counter distinctions. So we have a cross next to a a rope and somebody that on January 6, 2021, somebody built a gallows, and next to it is a cross. Next to it is a flag about Jesus or something. You know, Jesus's path to victory was through the cross. It wasn't through the Roman army. It wasn't by taking up spears and swords. His path to victory was through the cross. So those counter distinctions are very tragically ironic. Another tragically ironic counter distinction is when I've seen again. I don't mean to pick on pickup trucks. We actually have, for my window cleaning business, we have pickup trucks. But so not to, but when I see a truck and on the back bumper, there's one of those big old stickers of Biden that is bound and as if they're holding former President Biden hostage, big old thing. But then there's a big old Christian Jesus saves flag waving. It's funny, but it's tragic at the same time. So again, I'll quote. There was another incident a few years back with Bishop Budde. I was surprised that she was invited to speak at this thing the day after the inauguration, the prayer service, because there was an incident a few years ago. Bishop Budde, when Trump visited St. John's Church, he first of all he violently cleared there was a peaceful protest in that park, Lafayette Square, which was between the White House and St. John's Church, when he held the Bible upside down and got a photo op of the book he never cracked open. So Bishop Budde she was that's her diocese, that's in her region, right? So she had a comment about that right after that. She said, while the president cloaks himself in spiritual, this is from a piece she wrote for the New York Times, I think, after that incident. She said, while the president cloaks himself in spiritual authority, he preaches the antithesis. She said, Mr. Trump used sacred symbols to cloak himself in the mantle of spiritual authority while espousing positions antithetical to the Bible that he held in his hands. She also said in an interview, she said, let me be clear. The president just used the Bible, the most sacred text of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and one of the churches in my diocese, without permission, as a backdrop for a message antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. Everything he has said and done is to inflame violence. We need moral leadership, and he's done everything to divide us. So again, we are replacing the God of Scripture or the symbols of Scripture or Scripture itself with a God of our own making. We start with our own preferences and even prejudices, and then we back what we want, shards of Scripture or religious symbols. We back it into these prejudices. So that is a form of idolatry. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. It is God first. Right? It is God first. Or if you're non-religious or atheist, it is goodness transcends. We don't get to decide what goodness is. We have agency. We are thinking, we are feeling, we are spiritual. We have a sense of the transcendent. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? So we're, as human beings, made up of all of these things, and we have agency. We can discern, right? But one of my firmest beliefs is, perhaps even more so than there is a God, is if there is God, I ain't him. I am not the transcendent. I might be created in the image of God. I might have an understanding of God. The God might be within me, but I am not God. I am not God. I am not the ultimate arbiter of what is good from a non-religious standpoint. Goodness, right and wrong, there is an ultimate truth, right? And it's not either or, it's complicated. I get it. I get all that. I get it. But there is something transcendent. God is God. God is not what I am not God, therefore I don't create God. It's the other way around. Goodness is not what I decide is good. It's goodness is, truth is. And it's not the other way around. It's I am not the arbiter of truth. It's my job to understand what is true. It's my job to understand what is good. So, and a lot of folks have it the other way around. That's ultimately what idolatry is, you know. And the other way that this happens is instead of worshiping God, we worship politics in a way. Instead of starting with God and understanding, or starting with ethics again in a non-religious fashion, and then developing political and social positions based on what is philosophically, or religious people, what is theologically good, and then developing our voting practices from what we know to be philosophically good, ethically good. And then back, we go the other way around, where we affiliate ourselves, we attach ourselves to a certain politician or a certain party. And then we determine what is good based on what this person is saying. That is often, so we're replacing God with politics. Again, I'm going to quote from somebody who I'm so fortunate to have become friendly with. He's been on the program a few times, Pete Wehner. He explained it a lot better than I could. He had a piece in the Atlantic on the 11th called "The Cruel Attack on USAID." Part of what he said is USAID has, until now, worked in more than 100 countries, promoting global health, fighting epidemics and starvation, providing treatment for people with HIV/AIDS, educating children, and combating child sex trafficking, resettling refugees and supplying shelter to displaced people across the globe, and supporting programs in maternal and child health and anti-corruption work. It is a remarkable thing to witness. There are tens of millions of men and women who are regular churchgoers, who attend Bible studies and Sunday school classes and listen to Christian worship music, and who would raise a ruckus if anyone in church leadership interpreted the Bible in a way that deviated even slightly from their doctrine on any number of issues. And yet many of these same people insist that their faith commitments have led them to support a president for whom the cruelty is the point. A president for whom the cruelty is the point. As a result, there is somewhere in Kenya right now a mother of three asking, if I die, who will take care of my children? Donald Trump and Elon Musk don't care. It turns out that millions and millions of people who claim to be followers of Jesus don't either. It's really, a really startling way to put it. And Pete is a conservative Christian. He's a conservative politically as well. He's a speechwriter for George W. Bush. And he is a devout Christian, Orthodox Christian, a lowercase o Orthodox Christian. So you would think of him as a conservative theologically Christian, you know. So again, the idea is, in what ways are we? Thou shalt have no other gods before me, but folks have put politics before God, or put their politics before what is good, or politics before what we know to be ethically right and true. So all of these ways I need to, and I'm asking it of myself too, have Christians forgotten the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other God before me, or the way Jesus put it is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the ways that we're doing that are, we are rejecting the Jesus that we meet in the gospel accounts. If it doesn't suit our political preferences, then we reject that. What is that nonsense? What is that Marxist stuff? Well, it's Jesus, quoting him directly from the Sermon on the Mount. You might like it, but as a Christian, I start there and I back my politics. My politics come after that. So you might be rejecting the Jesus we meet in the gospel accounts. We might be replacing the God of Scripture with a God of our own making, as opposed to imago Dei, as opposed to being created in the image of God. We're creating a God that meets our preferences, and sometimes you see it in those silly, Jesus's Rambo, flags and T-shirts and stuff, or even worse, the Trump as Jesus kind of a thing. That type of imagery. We're creating a God of our own making, or we're replacing God with politics. We're starting with politics, and that's what we're worshiping. And then, backing God into it. It's all a version of the same thing. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And in what ways have we done that? So, man, this is a big one. We might have to revisit this topic and think it through, and yeah, just explore it some more. So I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks for putting up with me. You could tell that I'm getting kind of worked up about it. But it's this stuff I think about a lot. We have to think about this stuff because we have to figure out, at the end of the day, we have to figure out how to live well among each other and how to participate a little bit in tikkun olam, how to heal what's broken, right? How to heal this broken world. And maybe, hopefully, a lot of us can acknowledge that there's a lot that's broken. So I'm hoping to participate in tikkun olam. I'm hoping to participate in healing the world. So I'll just leave it there. As always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review, and now you can watch these conversations on YouTube and support us on Patreon. It's youtube.com/@politicsandreligion. Patreon is patreon.com/politicsandreligion. We have those links in the show notes. Your support really does make a difference, so thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.